it's always a pleasure to engage with you, and I hope to share with you some thoughts this morning from the idea of how we get those calf injuries back to performance. So calf muscle injuries and how we facilitate return to performance. This has been a fantastic month's worth of material focusing around the calf, and big thanks to everybody involved for putting it together. There's been some fantastic resources there and some amazing insights from clinicians and researchers, and I'll be drawing on a lot of the messages that we've heard from Tanya, Seth, and Craig also, and all of that hopefully collectively as we consider this really fascinating and challenging area of calf injuries. Hopefully there will be something to take away and to put into practice. So, I currently work most of my time anyway within Irish Rugby and oversee the system there. And one thing that we're really clear on there is that it's about building robust, healthy, resilient athletes. And we define robustness in the RFU as the capacity to engage, to consistently engage in training and games with maximal effort, so they can give everything they can every time. And we have seen a shift over the last number of years in terms of our injury incidence, away from typically before where hamstring was number one. What we see is it now moving to number two, and calf becoming the number one musculoskeletal injury. We also have a challenge with concussion, but our number one musculoskeletal injury is shifting towards calf injuries. And I know that this has been observed in other teams, in other unions, and also in other sports such as football. And so, how do we deal with these calves well? How do we get people back, and not just back to play, but how do we get back and make them robust and help them to be robust so they can perform really well? So it's about return to performance, not just getting them on the field. And this fantastic work that was done by Brady Green, along with Tanya and a number of other people looking at Aussie rules, was fantastic. And really, it's a very similar picture or shape of a graph to the work that was done out in Aspetar by Arnlog, looking at the recurrence of hamstring injuries. And what we see again, it tends to be is a reasonably high rate of recurrence, and that the greatest risk of recurrence seems to sit in the period immediately after return to sport. And what you see is that certainly within those first 25 days, there's a significant number of re-injuries, and certainly within those first sort of 50 days, we see the greatest preponderance of re-injuries. And when we look at the data presented in this paper, we see that the most of the injuries are in the same location, in the same place, in the same muscle. And so is there something that we can do with our rehab to facilitate not just return to performance, but repeated ongoing performance so that people are robust and get back and perform well? And we've seen it in a number of other studies. When we pull all of that evidence together, we see that there's a really common recurrence rate with these calf injuries. We see that potentially, and that's John Orcher's study from a few years ago, suggesting that there was a late season recurrence. Perhaps there's something about cumulative load in calf that we can consider, and how we manage that load over time. We certainly see that the highest rate of injury sits with SOLEUS injuries, and that we know that if you've had a SOLEUS injury, and certainly from Brady Green's study, is that you're more likely to get a recurrence if it's a SOLEUS injury, particularly, as well as we know if there's been some aponeurotic disruption. So how do we put all of this together, particularly then where we get the older athlete or the aging athlete with a significant injury history, many of whom if they're playing rugby in my setting, many of whom have a significant injury history. So what do we pull all of that together? What factors may be important to help us return people to performance effectively? And actually, when we look at the evidence, I would suggest that these are some of the really important considerations that may influence our rate of progression of rehabilitation, may also, though I think particularly, encourage us to monitor things really closely at that point about going back to return to play. So if there's been aponeurotic disruption, know that potentially that probably takes a little bit longer for people to get back, and is a risk factor for recurrence of injury, particularly if there's the SOLEUS involved. So the SOLEUS itself, and we'll see as we've talked about already through this calf series, and I'll mention again today, how important SOLEUS is in terms of force production. It's the powerhouse of the calf. We also know that previous injury, whether that's an injury to SOLEUS or previous injury to the ankle, is a significant issue. So can we redress perhaps some of the legacy, the injury legacy effects from previous injury, and building that into our rehabilitation? Our older athletes, how do we manage them? We also know that running seems to be an important component of this, but we'll consider, are there certain types of running that we need to build? Is there a way in which we can increase that? And I would suggest that then capacity, the repeatability of these factors all put together are really important. But these factors in and of themselves won't help us just return to performance, because if we're talking about performance, the sport-specific context is critically important. It's really important that we take into account, what does the calf have to do for that athlete in that activity day in, day out, not just on the pitch when they're playing, although that's perhaps the most important, but what they're doing day after day in training. Can they effectively in that maximally engage with training and competition? Well, let's start and consider some of those factors. A really recent study, they're looking at track and field athletes, or certainly athletics athletes. What you see is that there tends to be a suggestion here that the lower limb muscle injury, and this is looking just at the reporting of injuries over international athletics championships over time, that as we get more towards the distance events, away from the high velocity events, the location of the injury tends to shift from the hamstring and from more proximal down towards the calf. And you can see that in these graphs in female and male on the left and right hand side here. You'll see that red dots relate to hamstring injuries, and then these lighter blue dots refer to the posterior lower leg or the calf. And what you see is that as you increase then towards middle and long distance marathons, you see an increase in calf injuries and a corresponding decrease in hamstring injuries. So potentially it's about something that's running fast, but is it just about running fast that hurts the hamstring, or is it about the duration or the capacity of the endurance effect of running over and over again? We'll consider some of those factors. These data are also presented in this nice slide here, or figure here as well. And what we see here is injury rate per 1,000 registered athletes. And the top half of the circle are female athletes and the bottom half are male athletes. The larger the circle, the greater the number of injuries. And what you see here is certainly there for hamstring, as you can see, hopefully you can see my cursor, then hamstring you see larger circles, and for female and for male in sprints, combined defense, right up hurdles. But when we move to middle distance and long distance and up to marathon, what you'll see then for posterior lower leg, you'll see here when we get into those events, we see a significant increase in the number of calf injuries. So perhaps it's something about capacity. Running fast, we know, is very challenging for hamstrings, but perhaps running for longer, or where there's about volume, so capacity or volume seems to be important. Well, it's really important, therefore, to understand the demands in terms of capacity of our sport. And if I think of rugby, for example, this was just a sample of a number of games taken across the board in terms of our speed zones, and that's percentage of speed on the left-hand column, the meters covered right through to the foot contacts and stride lines. So if we think about the number of foot contacts, you'll see there that, over 2,000 foot contacts, we're moving at a very slow speed. Only 6 at sprint for these particular athletes that I chose. So we're not covering huge amount of sprint distances, certainly some positions over others. What you can see is then the stride lines, the total distance, but there's the volume. So we can't just say how much sprinting are we doing, or even how much acceleration, but we've got to think of it in the round, look at various factors, and we'll return and think a little bit more about that later on. But when we're thinking about the calf and our return to performance, I think it's important to understand the role of the calf. And this fantastic study done by Lai and colleagues back in 2016 looked at the activation patterns, or the function rather of the muscle tendon unit from a standing start through to accelerating, then through to maximal velocity or running fast. And if you see here in this graph, this is just so that you can orientate yourself to the subsequent graphs that come through. So FC is foot contact 1. That's the initial acceleration, then foot contact 3 right through to foot contact 19. And they then looked at the modeling for the SOLEUS muscle tendon unit function through each of these foot contacts. Okay, so going from acceleration right up to when we're at high speed. So slow speed with acceleration and maintaining high velocity. So what you see here then is that foot contact 1, and then 3, 7, 11, and 19, and looking at the muscle tendon unit function. And so what you see here is then in terms of the length, you see an elongation over the stance phase of the muscle tendon unit, and then a shortening. So as the line goes vertically upwards, that's it lengthening. As it comes down, it's it shortening. If we look at muscle fascicles, and this will be familiar to many people, we recognize that as we run, there we see that there is not much of a lengthening of the muscle fascicles. In fact, actually, when we're getting up, we're here at the foot contact 1, foot contact 3. You could say that's very much a concentric activity. So there's a shortening of the muscle, and then it's almost like an isometric or quasi-isometric contraction right through to muscle shortening. Whereas the tendon itself is lengthening at that initial foot strike and then shortens. So we see that pattern over and over again, and it's been well reported that the muscles work more quasi-isometrically, and it is the tendon to facilitate effective stretch shortening of the tendon itself. So the tendon lengthens and shortens while the muscle maintains a quasi-isometric contraction. So it's really important to understand this, and so that we can rehabilitate and return to performance. And the other thing then from the same study, I think, which is really important to take into account, is how much force is being produced then by the SOLEUS. And what you see here then again is the work loops, if you like, for this one. You can see foot contact 1, so the initial foot contact, and then for foot contact 19. So here we are running at high speed in the yellow line. You'll see that the total muscle force is only slightly greater than the force that is produced during foot contact 1. But the area under the curve is much greater. And if you think of that in terms of the area under the curve being related, if you like, to how much work the calf is doing. So it's producing the same amount of force, but it's producing it for longer. And so when we're running at slower speeds or at that initial acceleration, what you see is that the calf still has to produce the same amount of force, but it's producing it for a longer time. So therefore, the work as a function of the amount of force produced over time is greater than whenever we're running at high speeds. So it's really important. So running slow and running fast is quite different for the calf in the terms of the amount of work that it has to do, but not in terms of the amount of force. And that was really well illustrated by Dorn and colleagues in his study, and I took some of the data just from the original paper and illustrated it like this to demonstrate a point. What you'll see here on the left-hand side of the graph are the muscles, so iliopsoas, glute max, hamstring, rec fem, and the vastus. And what you see here, it's really quite striking when you look particularly at iliopsoas, glute max, and hamstrings, that as you increase speed up from 3.557 right up to 9 meters per second, there's an exponential increase in the forces being produced by the hamstring and iliopsoas muscles. So a really significant difference in the forces at high speeds versus slow speeds. Okay, so what we see here is there's a significant increase in force with speed in those muscles. Now, have a look at gastroc and SOLEUS. And what you see is that here we are, 3.5 meters per second, relatively low forces. Then it increases at 5 meters per second, goes up again at 7, and then drops down again then at 9 meters per second. So what we're saying here is that the calf muscles are working, producing high force at all speeds. In fact, the SOLEUS is working harder than and producing more force in terms of body weight than the hamstrings in all conditions except for at those 9 meters per second. So running fast is really hard work for hamstrings, but running slow isn't. Running slow for hamstrings is dead easy. It doesn't put much load through the hamstring, but it does through the calf. So it's not the same. So your return to running program must be different. And what we see then is that the calf muscles act, if you like, quasi-isometrically in all speeds of running. So if we look here, if these different speeds of movement in the fiber velocity in SOLEUS and for gastroc, you'll see that if 0 here is isometric, they're pretty much all pretty close to zero or slightly above. Certainly when they're at really high speeds, it appears to be isometric. So they're staying at that same position. Now, what happens when we get injured, or perhaps what happens when people recur their injuries, and what considerations do we need to take into account to ensure that we get good return to performance and keep them there? Well, this sort of beautiful study, landmark study from a number of years ago by Sousa was great. We looked at different drop jump conditions at gastroc and SOLEUS, and they put them on a carriage, and they put them at they established the optimal height of drop jump. That was 100%. Then they dropped the carriage from 50%, 75%, at 100%, so the optimal level, and then a supra-optimal at 120%. And just to orientate you to this pretty busy graph, what you'll see here is that on this side of this dotted line, that's the drop phase. When we go to the next quadrant there, that's the what we may call the eccentric phase, so the amortization, the lengthening phase, then the concentric phase, and then takeoff phase. And I really just want to draw your attention to what's happening in the muscle under these different conditions. What we see here with gastroc, and now SOLEUS, you notice being a uniarticular muscle, it works eccentrically and then concentrically. But if we look at what's happening in gastroc here particularly, well, it's working concentrically. We see the line sloping downwards. If we then look at what happens at 75, you'll see that the line is pretty flat and then drops. So it's isometric at the beginning and then drops to concentric. When we go to the optimal level, so these are the optimal conditions, again, for getting as much height as possible, look at what happens here. You see that the line is very flat and then drops at the same point as we enter into towards that takeoff level. And so it's isometric in the first instance and concentric. Now contrast that to what happens when we go supra-optimally. So we add additional external load, i.e. the external load being the force at which you land. Okay, and what you see here is that in contrast to the other conditions, the line slopes upwards. So the calf muscle itself, the gastroc, is working eccentrically and then concentrically. Okay, so why is that important? Well, I would suggest that the real take-home message from this particular slide is that at supra-maximal or supra-optimal drop jump heights, muscle activity shifts from being isometric or concentric to eccentric. And what we know, and again, this other study by Rubenson back at 2012, what they saw at running at different speeds, or walking and then running. At walking, we stay here at this part of the force length curve. We stay bang in that sort of mid-range of the curve, and we're able to work constantly in that easily, and we're not getting much fascicle elongation. As we start to go a little bit quicker, interestingly, that shifts towards shorter lines. So we work where we're strongest, where there's little challenge, and actually we just work sort of concentrically, isometrically and then concentrically to pull on the tendon to facilitate tendon recoil. Now, I would propose or suggest that if we take what we saw from the Sousa paper and we think about some of the things that we know about how muscles act whenever you add external load that is supra-optimal or supra-maximal, what's going to happen? Well, if I start to fatigue or I have an injury, I would suggest that what happens is we start working on this other side of that force length or length tension curve. And so as a result, we start to work at longer lines and we get greater fascicle elongation and we get pull and we work eccentrically in that lengthening contraction, if you like, that starts potentially to overwhelm the capacity of the muscle. And that could be as a result, I'd suggest, of fatigue, so that capacity issue, or injury, so where's the reduced capacity of the muscle to do that. So one of the things that we really got to consider really carefully, I think, within return to performance is the whole area of strength. We know that SOLEUS is a very strong muscle. We know that the calf is particularly important. This is a setup for when we regularly test our players. This is one of our players getting seated calf iso. We don't normally actually use the RX pad. It's just this particular guy, his knee was a little bit sore, so he padded it out. We usually use a solid, thinner, but solid, hard plastic thing underneath the bar so that we don't get that sort of soft soaking up of some of the energy. But in this case, when we look at strength, how important is strength? How strong, if we're going to get people back to return to performance, do they need to be? And how do we do it? So that's what I want to think about now. Well, what we know, and again, looking at the Hamner and Delp study, another great study looking at the relative contribution for vertical and horizontal acceleration from the different lower limb muscles. What you see here is that 77% of the vertical acceleration was produced by gastroc under each of these speeds. Okay, and we see, by SOLEUS, apologies, under each of these speeds. You see that gastroc again is higher compared to the vasti, the rec fem, glute max, those big muscles. They're dwarfed by the contribution of the vertical acceleration of SOLEUS. When we look then at the horizontal acceleration, well, we see that vasti, your quads, are particularly important for the deceleration component when we land. But when we think of the acceleratory component in terms of the speed, we see here again SOLEUS adding the vast majority of the proportion of that horizontal force. So SOLEUS is really important for upward and forward center of mass accelerations, vertical and horizontal force. Why is that important? Well, when we're running, if we do that, there'll be longer flight times, longer stride lengths, which we know correlate then with faster speeds. But the SOLEUS is really strong, really powerful. And then if we look at some of the other slides within, or other figures within this study, we'll see when we compare here, and these graphs are really nice, looking at the ground reaction forces. And if we look at the ground reaction forces, where these lines are vertical, it's a vertical force vector. Where they're sloping backwards to the left, it's a deceleration, and where they're sloping to the right, it's an acceleration force. Now, if we I just draw your attention before we look a little bit more closely at the y-axis here for SOLEUS. You'll see that goes up to 20, whereas the other muscles are sitting at 1 or 2. But let's look closely at what's happening with gastroc and SOLEUS. And so if we see here that throughout each of those different speeds of running, we see significant contribution vertically and horizontally by SOLEUS and gastroc. But just look at how much that SOLEUS is doing throughout the entire gait cycle here. And remember, this axis is a factor of 10 greater than the gastroc. So the same height is 10 times more than gastroc here. So what's the takeaway is that SOLEUS and gastroc, but particularly SOLEUS, is really important for that horizontal and vertical force. Now, if I'm going to get back playing sport again, I'm going to need to produce force. I'm going to need to be able to do that over and over again, and I don't want to be overwhelmed or working super optimally or super maximally. Craig Purdom, who many of you will know, is very kind to let me use a couple of the slides here just to reference it. And he has pulled this data together and created this lovely slide that shows the increase of tensile load in the calf for different activities. And what we see is an increase, and this can be really useful, I think, for rehabilitation progressions, but I know he's going to talk about that. But when we look at our running up here, we see again those similar ideas that once you get up to running, your calf is producing, the tensile load through the calf is really reached a limit almost by the time you're running 5 to 7 meters per second. The calf is working as hard as it's going to work in terms of the tensile load. So it's really important for us. We do isometric, seated isometric strength testing, as you saw in the picture before there, across the squad. This is the Irish rugby team national squad, and this is the force that they're producing relative to body weight. You'll see down at the bottom the raw scores in terms of 1500 newtons of force is the mean, with a big range, as you can see, somebody right down at some of the smaller guys at 776 and some right up over 2000. Interesting, the person who's producing, their 2,250 newtons was the same as a player who has had recurrent calf injuries over the last year, and for whom this has been a real focus for us to get him back to performance. And we've done it, and we've really done that very well, I think, because he's back, he's performing better, all his other performance metrics are up, and so far, touch wood, he hasn't been injured again. And one of the things here you see is pretty much our main scores in terms of relative to body weight is sitting at about 1.5 times body weight. That is not where we want our squad to be. We're very clear that our target, our national standards within Irish rugby, is that we want people to be able to produce 2 times body weight. We have some people who can get up close to it, and here you can see just green and blue are the left and the right, and you'll see that there's a good few guys sitting up in this range. The other thing that I've just highlighted here is that most of the time they're reasonably symmetrical. Each per group across the y-axis here is another individual, and what we'll see here is that they're mostly pretty symmetrical. I've just identified a couple of guys who are pretty asymmetrical, and obviously we're trying to address some of that. So strength is going to be really important in terms of return to performance, and we'll talk about how we do that. Also, but it's not just about strength, is it? It's about the ability to produce that force and the rate of loading. So our forces are there, but they're happening a lot quicker. So the rate of force development and the rate of force absorption will be particularly important. And again, Craig's slide here, looking at the rate of loading in terms of body weights per second. Here you see that again, there's a really significant increase. Whenever we're running faster, the rate of loading goes up significantly more in line with what we would have expected with the hamstring in terms of the force. So the rate of loading is something that we've got to train. So we've got to get them strong, but you've got to then retrain the explosiveness as well. So what we've done is we profile some of the explosiveness training by simple drop jumps. We do single leg drop jumps, and here, as you can see, by not just seated isometric calf strength, but standing isometric calf strength here, just using a force plate within a force rack. And looking across the squad, we'll see significant differences here from the seated calf. Now, we've been doing standing calf for a few years now. We started doing the seated calf just back in September. And what you see here is that in terms of force, we're producing, on average 2.4 times body weight in each of that. And particularly if we look at that in terms of the force, in terms of body weight, we've some guys right up here over 3 times body weight. And actually these numbers were taken a little while ago, and having looked at just more recent numbers over the last week or two, we see that average is creeping closer to 3 times body weight. So as a national standard, as a goal for us, what we've looked for is that they would have 2 times body weight on a seated calf isometric max test and 3 times body weight in a standing. So that tells us that just because you're strong in standing doesn't mean you're going to be strong in sitting. And that because of the whatever other workarounds or other strategies that you're using. But what we did here was we then looked at single leg jump height across the squad and looking at the relative strength, and just plotted guys in terms of across these 2 axes in terms of the single leg jump height and the calf strength in terms of their body weight. And really this helps us make decisions as we profile people. So when we're getting them back to performance, we see previous performance deficits and in terms of injury prevention, but also then in terms of our targets of where we want to get people back to. When we're working through a rehabilitation, clearly we're going to hit both of these. But for these guys sitting up here who are pretty explosive with good jump heights, we really want to focus more on strength. So we're thinking of some of that force velocity type profiling. For the guys down here who are very strong but not very explosive in terms of jump height, our focus is on developing explosiveness. For these guys who are down here who are neither very strong nor very explosive, they've got to do both. And ideally, we're looking at these lines are simply just looking as at the squad averages. So we want people to push above that as a minimum standard. So we want everyone to sit up in here. And I would suggest that those calves that go on to recur, those calves that go on to develop problems, potentially sit down in here. But I would say that would be my hierarchy of risk of recurrence, if you like, the guys who sit down in that quadrant and then followed by the other quadrants as well. And there's other factors will clearly contribute to that, such as age and the location of the injury. So thinking about developing strength, we've got to develop that vertical strength, and our minimum standard in terms of our capacity, so strength, endurance, and I acknowledge Carl Denver from Leinster Rugby, who's helped me with some of this, is that we expect people to have body weight on their back and do a bilateral calf raise for 35 reps times 3 sets. Alternatively, and I know a number of other people will do a single leg calf raise without weight, which is clearly then one body weight per side, and be able to do 3 sets of 25 reps in that. So that's our national standards, and that's where we want everyone to be. We want to develop eccentric strength as well, and we're looking at 2 times body weight for 5 reps and 3 sets of that. Those are our standards, and that's based a lot on some of Seth's work that he will have presented already. How do we develop this? And we really want to work hard, and simply then we just go into proper strength training in seated calf. We prefer either a seated calf raise machine or here a Smith machine or whatever focus we can get. It is a challenge sometimes being able to effectively load an entire squad on a seated calf, because if you only got one machine, it becomes very laborious. So we end up reverting to using bars in this manner. But there are other ways, I think, that we want to then start to develop the ability to use that strength. And so when we think, here's one exercise that we've brought in over the last few months that we've found really helpful, which is a very heavy sleds. This is our head of athletic performance for the national team working, so a heavy sled, and the focus, you see, it's almost like an Antarctic puck that he's pulling, and we see he's supporting himself and getting that good forward lean. So we're working, and look at the range, he's well into dorsiflexion here as he drives through. We want to get full extension, solid and stabilizing through. You can see him working hard, stabilizing through the hip and driving then up to get full extension through the calf. Really important to stabilize, and we found this to be a really good primer, a good way of developing some max strength through more functional patterns. So we're heading horizontal force, we're getting into really good range, and we're stabilizing through the whole body. Excellent exercise. It's been great for a lot of our Achilles problems too. But it's not just pulling, then we work in pushing. This is working through a bigger range and more like a sprint lunge. And again, here, what you see with this player, and he's probably not executing it fantastically well. We're getting good hip and knee extension, but I would love to see a little bit more stabilization, more triple extension out through each of those 3 joints there. So driving through, developing that horizontal force. So it's not just a matter of doing lots of calf raises. So we want to develop that. We also want to developing the strength. We want to develop, not just developing the strength. We want to develop, then work through that continuum of our force velocity curve. So starting off at low velocity, high force, and moving then through as we increase the velocity and reducing speed, and we move down along that continuum. And it really is a journey from one end where we develop max strength, and then right through where we're developing strength, speed, and right down to speed strength. Okay. The other thing is that we're doing horizontal and vertical, but there's also, we recognize that if you're going to play sport, it doesn't just happen in a sagittal plane. And so it's really important to develop off-axis movements as well. My apologies. I thought I had muted all of these in advance, but working then in some of these lateral movements, and just look at what the calf's doing here. Look at his position. So he's winding up that whole calf complex, and so we're biasing to different parts of it so that potentially if there's any areas. And here we're working really heavy, so he's able to drive laterally, and here where he's resisted with lightweight, but with an explosive dynamic and rotation with it. So we're adding a frontal or coronal plane, but also a transverse plane in terms of the rotational capacity. And so building that plyometric capacity, I think in terms of return to performance, is really important. So here's our plyometric pathway. We'll work to develop plyometrics, and actually when you're in rehab you use this as well. And so it's a 6-stage program, as you can see, if really we look at the goals at the beginning, what we're looking at, slower concentric work through range. So this is again plyometric pathway, not strength, just okay. We're doing strength as well in parallel to all of this. Then we want to work on some of the acceleration and the ground contact, then working on some of the specificity of activation, and then into rate of force development, and then the ability to do that over and over again. So I just wanted to unpack each of these steps for us, show some examples, got some videos, and we can discuss some of this later. Okay, so we'll see again. bad music, bad choices by these guys. The first thing I think is making sure that we've got a really good solid lever to drive off. This is what this stage is for. In terms of getting that return to performance, making sure that I've got a solid lever that I can drive off. So working on good intrinsic foot, getting good longitudinal arch, for the ability to drive off and get that high gear propulsion and maximize that windlass mechanism if we can. And so really pushing off and having a solid base. So working in foot intrinsics, which we do quite a bit, and then working slowly through range through some of those calf raises and control. Now, his technique is not the best, but it's, again, the main focus is about slower movement, the high heel march. Then we work through into the next stage. We work in those slow in that at a lean, so that we're working as well, not just on the vertical, we're working in a little bit more of a lean, and then we're working in these really slow on our forefoot heel raise type of marching. So really working in that nice slow ankling. So what's this all about? This is all about getting good ankle stiffness, good isometric stiffness, ability to keep that spring in there. So getting ready for the acceptance of the force. Then we make it more dynamic, and so we're working through here, as you can see, in a more dynamic fashion where we're getting ankling. I do like to do it in bare feet so that I can try to encourage more intrinsic foot activation, and then progress on to using shoes. Then doing not only in the sides up, in doing it in laterally or off axis. So we do stepping off. So we're really focusing on that ability to come back off. So that acceleration contact, so it's the quickness of movement. So thinking about our cues, the floors like lava, it's coming off, and then making it a little bit more dynamic on the next one. Then perhaps working some of the familiar Bosch type drills that many of you be familiar with. So stepping down, can I stabilize, but challenging that stability, challenge a little bit more where we're driving. Can I control? Can I keep that heel up off the ground? Can I really keep it stable through there and lock that hip? Then working through, as we move through next stages, we can work through to our conventional ankling track and field type drills, which many of you be familiar with. So working through this range of making sure that we're getting that nice, so a good dorsiflexion and getting good recurrence here. Working through into this next one as well. I thought I put all of these on mute, and something's changed, so apologies about that. But then now looking at recurrence and repeated, so double leg pogos, cross pogos, so we're looking in split positions, and I think it's particularly important, I think, for our field sports, so whether it's a footballer or a rugby player. I think it's also important for our runners and our track athletes as well. We're working through different ranges, so we're loading different parts of the muscle tendon unit. We're loading at different angles and in different ways. Then working through into the next stage where we're building onto that horizontal force forwards and backs, so multi-directional single leg hop, giving them, like a little drop jump over the hurdles, lateral side to side. So you can see that we're working up through the intensity, we're working through the directions to maximize the exposures that they're getting. And then we want to build the ability the capacity to do that over and over again. So here, repeated hop capacity with a bit of overload. So can I build a capacity over time? So we're trying to build a really solid base to start with, then the ability to produce force, control that force, the speed of movement, and then can I add the load, the direction, the speed, and the repeatability. But really then, I think other areas that I think is really important for us in terms of getting back into returning to performance is this horizontal explosiveness, particularly important as well. And working here now, whilst this is one of our physios working with a track athlete, but whether you're the athlete working here to drive, but this is particularly challenging, I think, is really nice for a lot of our rugby players, particularly this idea of having to decelerate and backtrack. If you think of where a lot of times where we get Achilles issues or calf problems, it's often when we're backpedaling like that. So it's really important, but also don't lose sight of what's happening here in the acceleration component. So if we look here again, nice and solid. See how she doesn't bottom out on that heel. She's able to plant the foot and drive. This is hard work here. So thinking about ways driving that and then moving it up and then adding adding speed to it. So we had our really high load horizontal force before. Now we're into explosive, unweighted sled, but able to drive. I would suggest if this, I would have liked to see this a little bit flatter, a bit of a better lean, so we're getting better range. But we can see we're now moving really quick. We're driving through into really explosive territory. So we started off at one end of the force velocity spectrum, we're moving down towards the other. Then we're right into max velocity stuff where we're getting really explosive jumps. These are good fun as well. People like them, but if you're really working to drive through that range, just getting through and drive and get full extension and explosiveness, so we're getting that high velocity. So we've got strength, we've got horizontal. It's really important to integrate those sport-specific skills. And I put this slide up because hopefully you can see here. Just look at the foot position that this player is having to get into, and he's just about to drive into this player who's weighing well in excess of 100 kilos with maximal force. So the idea that if you're only ever going to produce force in a straight line through your calf, we're in trouble because we're not preparing them to return to performance. And I would suggest that that's maybe been a limitation of some of our previous rehab. It's all been pretty linear. It's really important. Can I produce force in these maybe more messy, not as attractive, or if you like, conventionally perfect positions, but externally rotated, pushing hard with maximal force, and it's high load force here. So training those activities as well are really important. So making sure that we get as part of rehab, getting in, can I hit and drive? Now, this doesn't apply to every sport, but I'm showing you some lessons certainly from the sport that I'm with at the moment. And so what you can see here is just really drive and push hard and accelerate through those legs. There are other positional differences that we have in rugby here for people who scrummage. So can I stabilize here through this ankle like on one foot, and can I control, and then can I maybe play a ball? So can I add in a skill and a responsive component to it whilst under reasonably high load? Because it's really important that we take into account off-axis function. What we know is that the calf plays a really important role in off-axis function as well. And we see that there are greater peak ankle plantar flexor moments and power generation. And if you've got better strength than that, you'll sidestep better. Now, sidestepping is so important in so many sports. Our ability to change direction is going to be really important. So building strength, but just if you have the strength doesn't mean you're going to be able to use it. We've got to retrain the stepping. We've got to retrain the change of direction. Sidestepping, really important. And this really nice study done by Manier back a couple of years ago shows that SOLEUS is an important deceleration component during the first half of stance in that 45-degree cut, and then it changes to be the predominant contributor to ankle plantar flexion. So think about what's happening there. It's decelerating. It's giving a significant amount of contribution. Here it is here down in this bit. You'll see the minus bit being the contribution in this. So there's your deceleration, those red vectors there. So your SOLEUS is decelerating, and then all of a sudden it has to change to be the predominant accelerator. And so it's having to shift, and so it's working really hard. So you have to train it not just to repeatedly produce force, but to absorb force and produce force, and do that in different directions, in different planes of movement. This is how I think we start to restore and return to performance. And so the other thing to bear in mind is that that's then integrated with the whole lower limb function, as you can see from those other graphs in that study. What you see is that it's working in tandem or with the hip and with the knee and with the muscles there. So it's about tuning that. And we know then that, and I've seen lots of people who potentially where they develop a calf issue or some problems, and they've had a problem with their knee. I can think of one guy who recently, who had a history. He had an ACL. His knee was feeling a bit grotty, a bit stiff and sore, and his knee was sore. And he continued to train, and he shifted, if you like, from that concertina knee strategy for deceleration to a more of a inverted pendulum ankle strategy for deceleration. So he experienced some overload of his calf. So it's really important, if we're going to get back to performance, that we take into account all of those other factors. We've got to address what's going on at the hip and the knee, so that when we're thinking about deceleration and acceleration, we're getting appropriate integration of calf function with the function of the knee and with the hip. And so I really encourage you, because quite often I think in a lot of our calf we don't do enough of the multi-directional stuff, and it will be very game specific stuff. So it might be whatever skill execution it is. It might be getting down and up, change direction, tackling, whatever that might be. In this one, look at this guy's calf here. Look, he's having to decelerate it and he's off axis. Backpedaling, going sideways, down and up, getting off the ground, getting into a position, and trying to pick up a ball. So you can see that whenever we get into these positions, and particularly then if we look what's happening, down and up, can I get up off the ground? Can I get a ball? Look at here. Look at how his calf is having to decelerate or push against these things. So thinking about what the calf is really doing, if we're doing nice, neat, tidy exercises in a gym or in a rehab setting, and we're not challenging the calf in a methodical, systematic way like this, I don't think we can really return to performance. And I think that may contribute to recurrence. And so what we've developed is various models of progressions through some of our what we call situational speed. So if I'm in attack, what's my situational speed for attack? So there might be a lateral sprint pass, so you sprint at 30 meters, but you pass a ball at 20 meters. So you've got to step, change your weight distribution, and pass a ball to the side. You've got to accelerate and stop really quickly. You've got to potentially. Here you've got a linear acceleration and beat a defender, so you're starting to run in and with a step, because it's very uncommon for us just to run in a straight line. There's attack and a defender, so there's some unpredictable variation, that complexity within it. There's jumping up to catch a ball and taking it, and then stepping and twisting and turning. Then not only situational speed for attack, situational speed for defense as well. So this hunting drill, so you hunt a man, or you shadow a man, and then you tackle. You work in tandem with other people, so you're improving your situational awareness around what your colleagues are doing on the pitch, and then you're tuning your activity in regard to that. You're including unpredictable variation and complexity into our drills. Doing technique drills are really important. So what are some of the key techniques? In this case, it might be tackle techniques, whatever techniques it is for your sport, really important. Then throwing in something where you're blind, you have to stand behind the post and appear and respond and react. And so all of these things, I would really encourage you to have a systematic, logical progression of knowing which drills reflect the demands of the sport, and that there is a progression through, and we see ways to make each of these more difficult. Okay, so our plyometric pathway, just taking some of those things into account, starting out, getting good cueing, making sure we're getting good. We prefer to work on an external cue or an external focus of attention. So we're focusing on something else. We keep a straight line from toe to head would be an internal cue, but that squeezing a toothpaste out from your foot, you're standing on a tube of toothpaste, you're squeezing out from your foot, dangle your foot off a cliff. Can you trust your calf? Can you keep it up? Drive the power from the floor. The floor is like lava. Push through the floor. Stay high, lean your body as if you're running up a hill. I think these things in terms of restoring performance are really important. Our language are really important in terms of how we teach the movement, so that we incorporate that back into performance. If we have an internal focus of attention, if we have cues that are about foot, knee and ankle, what we know is that will not carry over to better motor learning, and certainly won't carry over into performance. So I'd really encourage you to think about your cues. So you say, this is what we're trying to achieve. Here are some cues that will help us to achieve it, and this is how it applies to performance. So what does all that mean for a return to performance in that bit of a whistle stop? Well, we need to have a really high force production capability. We need to be strong. We need to be able to produce the same force quicker when running speed, so that it's not just about being strong, but the ability to produce it quickly. But we need to do it over and over again. We've seen that idea of a cumulative load over time. We know that tendon stretch can optimize that force-velocity relationship. So we work at the quasi-isometric contraction. So that requires the neural coupling and the neural control of the activation of the muscle. So, and we need that off-axis action. So think about the components of returning performance: get strong, get powerful, build capacity, improve neuromuscular control, unpredictable variation, make sure it's multi-directional, and then control and monitor the amount of total load. Now, we like to look at total meters, and this nice study it was with clinical commentary really, by Paquette in JOSPT, just highlights the fact that not all meters are equal. Each of these are 10 meters, but the accumulated vertical ground reaction force over time is quite different under different conditions. Now, these are for distance runners. So if you're putting together a program, consider things like how fresh they are, their freshness. We can use things like stiffness indexes to help us with that. But we can just look at our freshness or measures of jump height or so on. It might be helpful if you don't have force plates, but contact times, for example. What is the time in the week where you're scheduling these different things? And we're not going to go for speed and strength and power development whenever the person's fatigued. What speeds are they running at, and where have they come from? What surfaces are we on soft surface? Are we on a 4G pitch? Are we on a track? And the psychological factors, I think, are particularly important. How fresh are they? How ready are they to engage? So some of these things, so it's not just a case of looking at all the meters, and so we will look across a range of different factors, from distance per meter, the density, if you like, the HMLD, that's a high metabolic load distance, and how much of that per meter, particularly important, I think, our high speed running and very high speed running, and our sprint distance. And for this person, what we see here in our color coding, if they're bang on where they want to be, or within their one standard deviation, it's grey, and if there are 2 standard deviations, it goes to red, and so if we go blue, they're below it. And so we see that here there's been a significant increase in sprint distance for this particular player. So we need to be aware of that, because remember the cumulative load that we talked about earlier, and how calves can, I think, they work hard all the time. So we need to pay particular attention to cumulative load under different conditions. So what are our principles for rehab then? I would suggest in order to restore performance, we've got to first get strong, get really strong. 2 times body weight on a seated calf isometric strength. That's where we want to be. 3 times in a standing. You need the ability to produce force. And what I would say at the beginning of our rehab, a common mistake I used to make, and lots of people make, is avoid the longer, slower jogs early on, because you get longer ground contacts, less recoil, and you're getting a lot of hard work, especially for SOLEUS. This muscle works hard. Give it a break. So I would avoid long, slow jogs, keep them short and sweet, and focus on quality, not quantity. Then think about building good foot-ground interaction, working through a good plyometric pathway, and then reflect the requirements of the sport. Think performance. Think, what is it they need to do in their performance? So here's our performance pathway, if you like, for return to sport, return to performance after calf injury. First, develop calf strength. Remember, do both vertical and horizontal. Develop explosiveness, both vertical and horizontal, and we've looked at a couple of examples of that. Get good sport-specific activation, particularly off-axis force or multi-planar force in difficult positions, end range, high speed, responsive, and then build the ability to do that over and over again. And I would suggest that you want to develop this strength before you start your running progressions. And so hopefully that's been helpful to you. Hopefully that's given you an idea or some points for thought. I'm happy to chat further. And thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.